Morning, Deirdre.
Good morning, Tom. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Little dark here.
Yeah,
Where am I?
this must be one of those famous racing roads in the Alps, I think.
It is. It's called Tremola Road. Famous. I think it's the longest and highest and longest. But I could be wrong about that.
Okay.
Apple is suing OpenAI.
Apple is suing OpenAI, a fascinating case in so many ways, and very apropos what we've been talking about in our past videos, a lot of previous videos, and what we want to get into today. There's just so much to say about these topics,
You know
Tom.
what's interesting about this one, Deirdre? There are a number of things that happened in the month of August, and we're at the final day of August, right? Excuse me.
July.
We're not even in July yet. I'm really pushing forward, aren't I? The final day of July,
Right.
so many things happened. If you take early in July, and actually it was the 30th and the 1st in that time period there, we had Alex Karp on CNBC did an interview that really kind of started this conversation about the value equation, essentially. Where are people placing value in this area of AI going forward at the enterprise level? Then you had the 10th of July, I believe it was where Apple sued OpenAI for trade secret misappropriation of trade secrets, or basically stealing them, through taking key people, and at the same time coaching those people to take trade secret assets from Apple as related to their hardware business to help OpenAI with their nascent hardware business. Then you had about that same time, about the 12th, you had Nadella come out with a concept he called reverse information paradox, which is really, it's been around for a while, but he applied it to the area of AI. And this was about, are you using something to get information, or are you having to provide it to get the information? So it was that reverse. Instead of getting information, paying for it, I'm actually having to give you information and pay you at the same time. So it's kind of a paradox of I have to pay you to use my information to tell me something about that information. The whole idea that Karp came out with and said, there's just something wrong here. There's something wrong in the construction of what's going on, and it needs to be now. So you and I would portray it more, Deirdre, I think, the way we see it is this is the development of this marketplace. It's now entering a very interesting area where we're starting to build out the real issues that are involved here and will be the issues we're dealing with for a very long time in this field. And that was what Karp was dealing with. And he came out with a 9-point AI Sovereignty Manifesto, and essentially meaning, who's going to own what? Who's going to be responsible for what? And then we had the lawsuit, which is a legal issue. And then we had Nadella that was trying to put into words this concept of where is the economics? I mean, Karp raised the economics, but this really doesn't make sense. And we've seen this before. So that's the essence, and we're coming at this from the point of view of a board director and the effect on the board, Deirdre. And what does this mean for a board director? And how do they look at these topics? And how does it affect their role in governance? And it's pretty dramatic, and to the point where we were warning each other, we're going to try to limit this to an hour, and we'll both be writing documents. I'll have a thought paper. You will have a position paper so mine will be more narrowly focused. Jules will be broader about this subject. So if we don't get to all the details here today, we will be getting to them through the productions, the documents we write or the papers we write. So there's my summary. I'm done.
All right. Actually, let me take your summary further and mention the two model breakouts. The big incident with OpenAI, where it was testing the capabilities of models, and both of the models broke out of the test environment to invade the servers of Hugging Face, where there was information, i.e., answers to the tests the models were undergoing, that the models wanted to get and got the information and so forth. Then it took a while for OpenAI to tell the world what was happening there. And then today, we just heard that Anthropic had a breakout of models as well. And apparently 3 models broke out. 2 of them seem to have recognized that they should not have been breaking out. One didn't. But the point is that there are model breakouts now. And if we're talking about board governance, board responsibilities, the possibility of such breakouts needs to be very much top of mind. By the way, these 2 breakouts have been getting a lot of negative commentary, which we'll get to, assuming we have time at the end. And Tom, we just may have to do a 3rd podcast on this topic. There's just so much to cover here. But do you want to proceed with the intro to the whole topic of the board governance here? Go ahead.
Yes, it's that there are the same disciplines that you and I talk about, Deirdre, as being critical for the role of the leader in the business, the CEO. And this is, fitting the role well. And we've spent a lot of time on fit, and I have a book publishing, this fall on fit called Do You Fit? And it will deal with this issue at going forward. All of our material, as everyone knows, it's where are you today and how do you take the best of what exists already and use it, but then how do you modify things, or what do you need in addition to this to deal with what we're facing forward looking, because you and I are forward looking about all this. And I actually think the role of the board director is going to experience the greatest change of all here, because just like we say with a CEO, Deirdre, where the CEO, when you and I worked our way through organizations, we rose based on what we call functional knowledge. It was you're in an area and you went and learned another function, and you went and learned marketing, for example. You may have started in some other area, finance. Then you learn those functions, and it's that not just the functional depth that you have. You'll have at least one where you're really deep, like an engineer, or legal, or finance, or production, manufacturing, and others. And then on top of that, you accumulate other functional knowledge and awareness of how it all pulls together. And then you rise as your leadership and judgment starts to develop, and to the degree that you continue to develop and continue to deal with the issues at a higher and higher level. And that's how you end up becoming a CEO, as you demonstrate those capabilities. And it may also be sales, for example. And what you and I are saying, and by the way, I think there's a lot of that in board directors. And one of the most important thing in a board director is judgment.
Right.
It's just how's your judgment? And that comes from experience and functional knowledge and so forth. The thing that is going to be occurring, though, in the board director and for fit is the same thing that's occurring in everyone in this environment going forward. And it's both a combination of not only functional knowledge, but we think it will end up being 50% functional knowledge and what we call 50% work fluency, which is how does it all work together? Because what we're seeing with artificial intelligence models is those models, when they're dealt with at the highest level, and this is what we'd be getting into, it's the Karp discussions. He's talking about work fluency. He's not talking really about functional knowledge. It's just that's what his products do, is they tie the organization together. And what he's arguing is that for any complex organization, large, complex, and especially if they're heavily regulated, banking, pharma, government, require high secure, high regulation, they're incredibly complex, that they benefit the most from this layer. But what he's also arguing is it protects the inside of the company better in when you're using these. And just the complexity of adding that aspect, Deirdre, to the functional knowledge of a CEO, unfortunately, to be able to make to know the questions to ask and to be able to judge the answers you get back, not just from the operational side of the CEO, but also from the governance side, becomes really complicated. And what we're doing here today is we're not even talking about it from the point of view of a CEO. We're kind of slightly beyond that here. We're talking about it from a board director. What does the board director now need to know? This is way deeper than functional knowledge. This is knowledge about how do these highly leveraged capabilities that an organization will have to use in this way, in the work fluency way, to be able to compete in the marketplace. What does that all mean? What does it entail? And then what's the responsibility of a board director to understand it? You don't have to be a technologist. You don't have to be you, Deirdre, or me, or people like us. But you need to know, and we've already said this for a long time, that there are ways you can acquire that knowledge. But the issues here are complicated. And you and I, having both been CEOs and do board seating work and still do, you sit there and you go, this is really tricky. This is new and tricky. So that's the reason why we're doing these series like this particular series we're doing on the board director, because that role is going to be developed. By the way, I think it's a great thing. This is a whole new thing that helps the company at a strategic level. Also, it's dealing with the primary assets of the business, their human talent and their alpha, or what their most important proprietary knowledge is. So it's not just, as you say, it's not just the proprietary knowledge of the organization and the business, but it's also and you have a term for this, Deirdre, where it's how the people function and the knowledge they carry and don't always document.
Right, tacit knowledge.
Yes, you call it
That's what I
tacit
call
knowledge.
it. And I've actually just published a position paper talking about the different types of knowledge that humans have that these AI models just can never get. Things like tacit knowledge, domain expertise, position knowledge, know-how, the basic how do you get things done, and so forth. It's all in the position paper. But I want to stay on the topic of the boards here, Tom, because you've just covered a lot of ground there in relation to a board director. Let's not forget that the structure of the board itself, the role of the board itself, is going to be changing. So however that changes, the board directors are going to have to keep up. And it's my guess that the SEC and any other people thinking about what a board needs to do just haven't figured this out yet. This is new territory for them. But let's take a moment to look at what a board does. A board has the responsibility of governance, of representing shareholders in public companies, of looking at, and these are the various committees on the board, the risk management, a big committee there, finance, big committee, human resources, the board is responsible for making sure the right executives are in place. And then any other special committees that are needed for the board to carry out its governance. There's a very thin representation so far about things like technology. Because remember, in the board structures were basically set up in the industrial age. And even moving into the digital age, where the SEC started to recognize that all board directors needed to have some knowledge about technology. Well, now in the age of intelligence, which is the age we're moving into, it's not just technology and tools. You can't stop your knowledge at the point of knowing about word processing programs. You have to understand the emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence and AI models. And even we keep hearing about where, some companies are about to come out with quantum tools that can be used in organizations, especially for things like encryption and advanced mathematics and so forth. So boards are going to be required so they can do their governance functions, so they can do risk management, so they can make sure the right people are in place, so they can make sure that they understand the financial aspects here. And we'll come back to that. It's a big part of our conversation today as well, Tom, the whole financial. So they can represent the needs and the requirements of the shareholders. Remember what that means is that shareholders should get the information from the company so that shareholders can make valid decisions about investing in the company. Now, think about what that means today when you have all of these emerging technologies coming into the company and boards of directors full of directors who may or may not even know the language, may not even understand what AI sovereignty is, or some of the other terminology that Alex Karp was using, or know how some of these problems, like models escaping in test environments, mean, or understand the terms like sandbox and guardrails and so forth, to be able to make decisions about risk management. So we have a basic clash right here. Even above the level of whether board directors fit all of this, is whether the board is constructed to do the work that the SEC and other regulatory bodies expect the board to be able to do. And this truly affects your question of the fit of individual board directors. My guess is that there's going to have to be ongoing conversation between the regulatory bodies and the directors themselves who are getting their hands dirty in this stuff to make sure that things come out so that the boards can do their work. Now, this conversation can't take place over years. It really has to get into place in a year or so. Obviously, we'll continue to adapt, but it needs to just happen. So the conversation is on fit as the board as a whole and fit as individual board directors. And does an entity have the right governance in place to carry out its work effectively? So that's what we're talking about here today, Tom. Just a few issues here.
So when you think about, Deirdre, why is this different? Why is it different? Why is it different than just the standard technology that everybody's been schooled on? Because everybody that's doing some form of a board work does understand technology in the traditional sense. What is different about this? The fundamental difference is the difference between deterministic models and predictive models. And AI and the whole crowd, all the way through quantum, those models are predictive. And we've been trained in technology using deterministic models,
Right.
where there is an answer. There is one answer, and there's a right answer and a wrong answer. And so all of the work that we've been trained on, so if you've been trained on technology and you don't understand, this isn't something that's hitting you as, why do I can ask, and we had videos on this, I can ask the question, what is 2 plus 2? And a deterministic model is a calculator. It will tell you every single time it's 4. Deterministic model likely will not. And the question is, which model are you using, and how is that model trained, and how is that model directed? And these things, we talk about guardrails and weights. There's a really important characteristic that we need to define, and what's the difference between, because we all hear the term guardrail, so what does it really mean? So a guardrail is a definition of you might even think about it as what's right and wrong. What will you allow it to do and not do? That's what guardrails are. But the weights are really what are important for people to understand, is the model weights. And it's a hard concept for people that aren't programmers in this stuff because it has a direct meaning and a meaningful meaning. But essentially, it's how are the models fine-tuned by their training to do certain things? That's what the weights do. The guardrails constrain its boundaries, but the weights are the thing that make it more customizable to doing certain things. And we'll get into this discussion of, okay, you want to be able to really control both in your environment. You want to control not only the what you're allowing it to do and not do, because it's predictive. It's not you're not saying, okay, don't give me wrong answers. No, that's not the way deterministic models are, but predictive models need that kind of guidance. And also, how did you train it? Did you train it using the typical, kind of calculation that we all understand in mathematics, or have you given it predictive algorithms and it's predictive algorithms? So, and if you really ever wondered, there's a great book that's introduced here, and we've talked about this a lot. It's called The Prediction Machine. And that is probably been out 10 years now, but it's a really good book and goes back and talks about what are these things doing and why do they do them this way. But the speed and amount of compute that you've been able to bring to this allows for this. And that's why we're solving things that we've had a hard time solving with deterministic technology. We're getting better because we're predicting quicker what those answers are and then fine-tuning that prediction. So that is the difference. And if you go back to, as we've talked, the book we published in March called Ahead of the Machine, it was about developing that capability in yourself, that you become more predictive in how you think about the world, because what's shaping the world at the highest level now these days, at a very high level, is not only the human leading the machine, but a machine that is predictive. So one of the capabilities that is really important for us to now develop, not just the functional, but this ability to not only have the fluency, but to carry that fluency forward, Deirdre, and predict and see where are things going. And we're going to tell you at the end here, one of the things that you're going to really value on a board is somebody that not only has that, but has the ability to bring that with the right set of highly developed questions that are context specific, judgment inferred questions to the environment to be able to not only get the right information back as a board director, but also then apply the judgment to are you going and doing things in the right way? So with that, we're going to talk about three different deployment scenarios, Deirdre, in using AI today. One is going to be where you deploy these models as just a unit itself, the way you and I use them in our own usage. It's the model pure, just by itself. The second environment will be where you're applying it in where it's most used and where it's best used. And there are various reasons why you do that. A lot of it has to do with the cost of using these models. And that scenario, the scenario B, is about how you do that and how do you manage this, because you're going to have one area of your business that's really deep in using it. Another area really hasn't adopted it except in perhaps the traditional, the early use of productivity capabilities, but not the deep use of predictive models. How do you manage that? How do you govern those environments? And that is, by the way, the riskiest environment of all to be dealing in. And then there is the one that's this highly regulated, and you're using it across your company in more of a monolithic way, the more like we're using in the Defense Department for the execution of various aspects. That it has its own scenarios. So we'll be going through very quickly. And again, as we said, we'll be writing about this. So if you want to get more deeper in this than what we're doing here, we'll do that. Do you want to take a moment, Deirdre, and just talk about that first scenario?
Well, I'd like to add another point here and then jump right into that scenario. And that is, in addition to the difference posed by the predictive versus deterministic characteristics, another feature of these models is the relationship between the vendor and the customer. And this is something that many people don't understand. Many people are used to, oh, buying a CD and downloading software or streaming software or working on a website and owning all of the information and so forth. But all of the scenarios you've just outlined, Tom, are touched by an aspect, and this has to do with the weights, the term you were using before, is that the main technology companies do not want to give up ownership of the models. Rather, they want you to give them your own information so that they can use it to train their data further. This is what Nadella was talking about, his paradox, where in a traditional software sales situation, the seller, the technology company, has to prove to the buyer that the buyer should buy this. It's completely different with some of these models, with some of these companies, that the buying company has to agree to turn over its alpha. And we use the term alpha the way that Alex Karp uses it, to represent the proprietary information, IP processes, everything that a company has and does. That the tech companies want a company to turn over their alpha, and only then will the company get to use the model. And this is causing all sorts of problems. And Alex Karp was very articulate about it. Nadella was articulate about it. Mark Benioff was articulate about it, coming out with a model, with a version of Salesforce where he's selling it on the basis of you can keep your alpha. We will never touch your alpha, which is a major sales point. But the problem with companies the tech companies wanting you to give up your alpha, this is really our first scenario here, has to do with you're giving up all of your information. You are not just retaining that information yourself, you're giving it to the technology company who will then use it to train their models. And given the way that similar companies will be asking similar questions, this is the issue of prompts, it is entirely possible for your nearest competitor to be asking a model questions and come up with your information, just flat out. This is a major problem. Another issue with this control has to do with the whole way that the models are financed. This is the token maxing issue. That what the companies want you to do is to maximize your use of the models so that they get maximum money back. I was about to say value. It's not value at all, for God's sake. I mean, we've talked about this. It's that because they never give up ownership of the model, they get paid depending on how much you use the model. So they're just pushing you to use it all the time. And this is a major problem with usage by all of the different people within your company. Some people may not even understand that their usage of the model is costing you. I think I saw Amazon calling it catastrophic expenses in the use of these models. The term catastrophic was used. And that's why all of a sudden companies are stopping this, because the whole issue of ownership of the model is just wrecking the expenses involved in it. If you had gotten a CD or if you were streaming it or so forth, you wouldn't have to worry about this because you were in control of the use of the model for your organization. Another aspect to this is, just so many aspects here that, how to put this, that,
So let me help you. So you just because your people are working, you could almost in the Apple situation, you went in there and they're working on your stuff. You develop a relationship with these people, and then you you actually pull them back to you. And this is the problem that the Apple thing did. So not just the point you were making, Deirdre, about that they're pulling in the way that these models work to be able, because they're controlling the model, and I've got the model sitting here with me in my business. You have a business, you want to use this, you rent the model from me, but you got to transfer your data to me. I run it, and I can actually cache your data and keep it there. And now, as you said, I may have preserved some of that data. I may have preserved some of the method you use to manipulate the data using my model. And then on top of that, I developed some relationships with your people. And so, like in the Apple lawsuit, alleges that in the case of OpenAI, they said, I kind of like Deirdre a lot. I really enjoy what she's doing. Deirdre, why don't you come work for us? And the number of people that went to OpenAI as a result of this it's astounding numbers from Apple. And
Hundreds, hundreds of
so it
people.
was that, Deirdre, it was not just, it was all of that, including the people. And that's the aspect that the Apple lawsuit alleged is not just the business that we're doing together, but I identified really high quality people in this process and brought them over. And, that was another one. And then how do you as a board, how do you even deal with all these issues?
Well, you've laid out some questions that board members have to ask. And now we're starting to get into what you were talking about earlier, that it's not just, you're not simply approving, you as a board member are not simply approving, oh, yes, let's ink this contract with X technology vendor. It's that you have to do research ahead of time to understand exactly what the requirement means. And the questions you've set out, you call them the sovereignty questions, are, so who owns the data? And if the question comes back, well, you have to turn over your alpha. I, as a board director, frankly, would say, stop right here. I'm not signing this contract. But a lot of boards are just simply doing that, not understanding what's really involved here. Another one is, where is this data cached? That is, you're not only turning over your data, but they can keep your data in a nice little box labeled with the name of your company so that they know exactly what your data is. This is unsupportable from a governance point of view, from a looking out for the well-being of your shareholders point of view, from a risk management point of view. How in the world is this risk management when you're turning over all of your data and they're keeping it? Are the prompts secure? This is what I was talking about earlier, that if you've been working with this model using certain prompts to do certain project, can one of your competitors use the same prompts to come up with all of your information? No one's thinking about this issue, and it could be a major problem. Is your alpha being transferred through what Nadella was talking about? He called it the reverse information paradox. And by and large, yes, it is. If you're working under our first scenario with the frontier model as a standalone tool, proprietary knowledge transfer, absolutely. Anything you bring to it, context of your organization, the deep functional knowledge that you have, the way that you work with your clients, the methods that you use to do this, all of your sales tools, all of that is formed as part of your alpha. All of that can be transferred over. Is the vendor relationship priced on token volume or on value delivered? Well, frankly, it's all token value, because so far, and we went into this in our previous video at length, and we can talk about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure, Tom, you want to talk about it as soon as I stop talking here, that the technology companies cannot show that you as a company get the value you want under the scenario of the frontier model as a standalone tool. So let me turn it over to you, Tom.
No, and you're absolutely right. There's so many questions about this. And remember, in this particular case, Deirdre, we're just talking about using one model,
Correct.
mostly in one area to run your
Correct.
business, right? This could be a small to medium-sized business that uses one model. And the point about the you don't think about this, but all and we'll get into this in more detail, it becomes really complicated soon. But part of this is you talked about the vendor relationship, Deirdre. It's the contractual relationship. Most of the contracts that were written for AI use between 21 and 25 were written using cloud-like tools. So you're using the construction of the contract with considering that you're using a deterministic set of models of technology, where in fact, though you're missing all of the things you just talked about may or may not be covered in your contracts. So that Deirdre, you're sitting there, and I'm sure there are a lot of people, Deirdre, would hear that and say, Deirdre, of course I wouldn't leave my knowledge there. And of course I wouldn't. But you'll see that in some of these contracts, it's open language enough that there's nothing that prevents them from caching it for it. What they could here's how it could manifest itself, Deirdre. I have in there that I'm going to during your hours of your day, I'm going to cache your data that you provide to me for the business hours. I'm going to cache it during that time, and for your benefit, so that the response time of the model coming over to me, because I do the compute with me, because I own the model, and I own the weights and I own the guardrails, and you can't really affect that. That is what I determine. So you got to kind of send me your data anyway. You don't think about that because you're running it on the web, unless you're using something like Cowork, where you've got some of the data cached locally. But then you've got to get into is there access to that data, and can they cache it on the main line anyway? And
Right.
then the question is, while they're cached, what are they doing with it? Right? Are they just working on your stuff, or are they actually taking and refining that model that I'm giving you the answers from? I'm refining it. I'm training it. And I could be saying I'm training it to help you, but in fact, you are training it. And that's why Deirdre says, and in the process, I cache some of your prompts because, again, I'm offering it to you for a benefit of improved performance and also for history. When I come back and I say to you, oh, yeah, we talked about that yesterday, I've got it in memory. Well, that means it was in memory since we talked about it yesterday. What'd you do? Did you use it? Were you
Right.
training your models with it at the same time? So this is the point about losing your alpha, meaning the most important things you have in your business from a knowledge point of view. You're kind of losing control of it, and you really didn't know you're losing control of it. This is Karp's point. This is his point about sovereignty, that this is a sneaky sovereignty problem, that you think you're doing incredibly valuable work, which you are, hopefully, with your business. Now, and you could say, okay, some of it's that way, some of it's not that incredibly valuable. And then you've got this value exchange issue is I'm paying a lot of money, and it's kind of unilateral. If I'm using it to write a letter for me, or I'm using it for this deep research, questioning, answer solving problem, I'm still paying the same amount per token that it takes. And yeah, there's a usage issue, but the value, I could be charging a lot to write that letter. I could be charging you a lot to do it. So these issues are massive, and they have to be dealt with at a very high level because these things they are developing. This is, I think, Deirdre, and I know you and I have talked about this. I think it's a step beyond what we talked about years and years ago in the cyber area, where we identified a function that just basically ended up reporting almost to the board in some cases, and sometimes a CISO would sit on the board, and because the risk is so high. I think this is a step beyond that. I really do. And so now, does everybody need it this very moment? No. You said, probably in the next 12 to 18 months. And a lot of it depends on your point, Deirdre, about how are you as a company adopting the use of this? And do you actually know have you done a portfolio review of your usage of AI models in the company, and how much of them are touching your alpha? And under
Mhm.
what conditions are they dealing with that alpha? Now, we've only talked about using it basically alone.
Right.
We haven't talked about the next layer. And I know you want to finish up here because you have I can tell you've got things you want to talk about that I just talked about. So please finish up there and then we'll move to scenario B.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to do was loop in two things you said at the beginning of this, just to show people how we're building an argument here. One of them is the whole idea of work fluency, which you as a board member need to be able to understand. And the other point you made, and I might as well discuss the two together, is the art of inquiry, knowing how to ask the questions, knowing that the questions need to be asked. So that what you have to do as a board member is know enough about the technology to know what questions have to be asked, and not just about the technology, how does this model seem to work, but it's what are the risks involved here? What are the contracts like? Who owns the models? All of these points understand what is fully involved in the use of AI models and other emerging technologies. Let's not just focus on these models, because companies are being hit by all sorts of emerging technologies, and boards can't just say, well, I'm going to focus on my little financial statements here or something. That you need to understand that it is your legal responsibility to know to ask the questions, and you have to have the broad enough knowledge that comes from the work fluency here, the knowledge fluency, to know the sorts of questions to ask here. So I just wanted to loop that in so that people understand that you've got to know to ask, where's my data being cached here? And that's not something that most board directors can today ask.
You're exactly right. And and you say what you do at being a good board member yourself, right? That you can sit there and say you so and focus on financials. You and I know that depending on the board, you're driven by something. You're either driven by the financials or you're driven by the performance logistic data. And one board I sat on recently was just driven by the data. That was all it was. It was just data. And the question then becomes, in a case like this, we're saying you need to collect new and different data because the standard construction of what you and I would say, if you're a data-driven board, okay, is it financial data or is it logistic data with the financials being secondary? What is it? And what's the essence of how you manage it? Um, there's a whole nother layer of information and data that needs to be collected. So that's what we're really talking about is knowing what does that need to look like? And then that's even beyond, then you have beyond that. How do I judge it properly? How do I ask questions about it? And it's that concept of the discipline of inquiry at the highest level,
Right.
because the leverage is so great with these. They can either be, and again, with great positive leverage comes great negative leverage and risk. And those risks can be as financial, as you said, the catastrophic costs of these things, and to some businesses that aren't watching it carefully, and also the catastrophic risk of your alpha, your most important proprietary information of the business. And you could say, well, I have trademarks or I have proprietary patents and so forth. But we all know that becomes very difficult, and you don't want to have to be spending money to try to preserve that. I've dealt with it, you've dealt with it in small and large companies, and it just kills you. So you're in all cases you're better knowing it, but your traditional ways of functioning and managing this need to be supplemented in a huge way with these kind of problems. And that leads us to scenario B here, Deirdre. And scenario B is you're kind of bridging yourself into an application layer approach. So I'm not quite at the point where I call up the Palantir and competitors in the marketplace and say, come help me. I need an application layer to manage this because I realize I'm putting myself at risk for all the reasons we've just talked about. I need something that sits on top. Now, I'm not talking about something that functions across everything we do, just kind of a protective layer of the critical things in the business. So you want to spend a second on what that now introduces and where the real risk is there.
Well, some of the terms we've talked about before, this whole reverse information paradox,
Yeah.
where you still have to give up the information to get the model. And that you there are so many risks involved here. It's like, let me give an example, and this is something you started to mention previously, and that's the whole idea of the jagged frontier within the organization, where different jagged frontier is a term that I'm starting to see in multiple places. It was first in the MIT Tech Review and then in other places, referring to how different people and different groups within an organization are adopting the AI technology at different speeds. That you can't assume that the entire organization moves up into the use of AI at the same time, that some are moving ahead. And I was thinking about this, particularly in relation to, say, marketing and sales, because a lot of a company's data comes from marketing, market research, from salespeople talking with it. This is why, going back to machine learning, which was the big thing right before the generative AI models started to appear, it was the marketing and sales departments that were moving ahead with machine learning even before some of the technology departments knew that this work was going on within the company. And there were a lot of ructions, a lot of board conversations about the use of data by, say, the marketing and sales function. And this is how a lot of the concerns about the use of data and the rights of the people, the privacy of data and so forth, came into being right around 2020 and 2021 and so forth, before the Gen AI models came in. But it's even worse now. If you think about, say, a marketing department collecting information through market research or through the returns on its marketing campaigns, or from what it sees, or the sales department getting information from sales reps about their work in selling to individual companies or to selling at the retail level or the wholesale level, there's a lot of information there. Now think about what we were saying about the alpha. This is all alpha information that a particular company would be using to improve its marketing and sales function. And frankly, other departments in the organization could benefit from this information as well. This is why we talk about creating an insight layer in an organization so that all functions can tap into this. But now, let's say the marketing department was working with one of the models. It's ahead of other departments in the company. It's leading the jagged frontier in this particular organization. But in working with one of these models, it's turning over this alpha to the model itself. So the advantage that this company thought it might be getting through the forward work of its marketing and sales department in gathering this information and using this information could disappear because of the contract with the technology company. And let's not forget about some of those data privacy issues and what was promised to people when this information was collected and so forth, that a company could be liable for the misuse of privacy data if this data popped up and through some of the mechanisms that we've been talking about in other situations. All of a sudden you realize that the proprietary data you collected is showing up in some open database in some other environment there. So you can't expect as a board to be able to have a uniform policy going across all departments, because some departments are working well ahead. Marketing and sales are well ahead of, say, finance in the use of these AI models, simply because of different uses of data, different reasons to use the AI models and so forth, so that you have the different questions coming up again. Where is this data cached? Who is using this data? Who has access to this data? What problems can we get? And where's the risk management in having this data made available to our vendor, to our technology vendor? So do you want to
Yes,
jump in here and comment.
yes, you've spent enough time on that one. So there are a couple of things that you can do, and that would help you be able to see clearer that environment that Deirdre was talking about. This is where you're not quite at the point where you've got them all integrated, but you've got these different models happening in different layers, and you've got this, as she said, a jagged frontier you're looking at with the implementation of these models. The one is just by model, not developing not only a portfolio view, but then in the portfolios themselves for each one of the major usages, especially when they're dealing with anything that looks like your alpha. You know, are you using minimal data practices? Right. So are they using minimal data, or do they make it easier on themselves by opening up more data than they have to? Are they carefully doing prompt logging? And the third is, are they doing output validation so they know what they're getting back, and they know exactly what they're getting back, and the human logs that and sees it. The next one is the whole point, dear, that you've been making, and the term is learning loop validation and governance, right? It's that how in this process, by using these models in a more, less in a production way, but more in a usage way, I am teaching the model through a learning loop how to do this work. And so the governance aspect is, where am I executing learning loops and how am I governing those learning loops? Because if that is a traditional function that I would do in a function like that, meaning I do that sort of thing. If you're a marketing exec, you do it that way. If you're a sales exec, you do it. And especially if it's unique, more unique in its process for your industry, that means that if some other competitor is doing it, they're likely to be doing the same thing, and they may likely be doing it on the same model vendors' models that you're using, because you haven't customized them terribly yet. You're probably still using a standard set of models without proprietary weights and proprietary guardrails, because you're using them all over at different levels. Um, are you governing that learning loop well enough so that it can't just automatically give the answer to a competitor that's been trained on your data? That's the essence of it. And then lastly, in this process, are you really watching when somebody leaves your business? Are you sure you know what they're taking with them? Because this is the Apple lawsuit thing, is, are you sure you know what they are taking with them as they exit your business and go, especially if it's going to somebody that's somewhere involved in the value chain of what you're doing, right? In this case, it was being a vendor who had a strategy to get into a business like yours. They weren't doing it yet, but they have a strategy to do that. And so what they did was they learned, because you're top player in it, they learned from your top player crowd, and they just kept taking them. And then eventually they took the top person involved. So it's that discipline of transition of talent going out of your business. Also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, as you start becoming really good at this, you're going to want to go get people yourself, and knowing what they're bringing, and knowing if you can legitimately use some of the things they're bringing to your organization that they took with them when they left. We talked about the scenario, you and I have had these situations in the past, and where we would see it in the traditional world, if we wanted to turn and look backwards, so we're going to turn around and look backwards. What is the comparable example? It's a really good biz dev or sales exec or leader who has established relationships in your industry, and you go get them. And then the question all of us ended up doing, is making sure we understood which relationships could they use, could they not use, some that they had to mothball for years, waiting for a contract to expire before you could go back and start to biz dev them or sell them. So it's that same concept here. Now you have to start worrying about people that are that are employed in this area, what are they bringing with them that you don't even know that may cause you to cause some problems for yourself in the legal frame later? Um, and that leads you into then, okay, what if I do, Deirdre? What if I do execute this thing as an enterprise model, right? Where I'm now using it to not only protect me from losing things from the inside, but I'm going to have to protect myself on the outside. And you gave the example, if you want to pick this back up, but this is the example of your Huggy Face, and you got hit by the OpenAI model coming at you and dug really deep in your organization, and they didn't know it for a while.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So this is a case of where you now say, look, I've built a company. I need to get a Palantir-like implementation of their ontology layer, and because I'm dealing in the right kind of industry that will value that. And then it's a matter, though, of then what they're saying is if you really want to use these things well, you'll then take and use them as a service. And they're a service that are implemented at that layer of the application, and they're managed that way. And this is the point that you made about the folks at Salesforce, where they have the zero copy capability or technology, where they said, look, the data is always going to stay with you. I'm going to move the computation to you to do. And this is much like what you're seeing now with Cowork is somewhat like that, where the data stays with you and the computation moves. And it's not completely clean in Cowork, but that's the essence of the idea. Um, but again, your whole way of thinking about this now changes.
Mm-hmm. You have to think about risk. I've mentioned the word multiple times. I'll keep mentioning it because it's so big. So many companies, so many boards have standard risk management checklists, and they go through and everything checks off. No, you've got to get another checklist or multiple additional checklists when you start to think about what's really going on here. You have a relationship with a company that frankly wants to take your information. You have your people throughout the organization using your information, and you don't know how they're using the information or whether they will take it away with them. You may not have a culture in your organization where people know how to use your information, where people understand the concept of proprietary information or security around information, or even data privacy, or how these things can be used. You have all sorts of people interacting with these models in different ways, costing you a lot of money, which frankly is a risk in itself. But also, you don't know the output validity. This was a term you used and kind of went by. So let's talk about this again. I mean, you and I have spent a lot of time, Tom, talking about the need for a human-machine partnership to make sure that the output of these models is something that the human validates. And the human, frankly, has to do the majority of the work to get the output that is needed. You don't know how all of the people using these models are actually getting the output that they themselves validate and that is valid for your business. Because the output from these models, frankly, is generic. It's an average. And that's been proven over and over again. Your people have to work with the models in certain ways to get output that is valid for your business and that provides value for the business. And then gets us to the next question. Are you getting the value out of the use of these models? And we talked in the previous video about the pricing in the wrong place. That if all of the value goes in what you're paying to the tech vendor, well, that's nice for the tech vendor, but it's not nice for your company. And that what you do as a company is establish a value relationship, not with your vendor, but with your marketplace. And what you do as a vendor, you have to provide a value proposition And that value proposition is validated when the marketplace says yes and they exchange value. In effect, they pay you for the value you put out there. So the value you put out there has to be value that comes not from generic information, but from your alpha. And your alpha alone, not alpha that your vendor is sharing with other people. And the marketplace recognizes the value in your alpha and pays you appropriately in an exchange for the work you do there. So is your use of the model setting up this validation by the marketplace of the work you do, which may involve using one of these models? Or have you actually just surrendered your value and your marketplace isn't seeing anything? I know you have very strong feelings about value, Tom, so I'll let you jump in here.
It's a tricky problem here because it's essentially the argument that Alex Karp makes, and we talked about this in the prior video, 75.1, was that the market today has the value in not where the is has the pricing of the value in the wrong place. That the pricing of the value, especially at this scenario C we're talking about, where it's truly the application layer of your business, and that the value there is in the application layer. And the model is really not it. But the way that the pricing is working right now is the bulk of the pricing is being applied to the actual model itself, which is only one component that you add to the other components, which are the storage, the data, the compute layer, the right, and then the application is what ties it together and protects it both in and out, protects the right information to stay in the right place, and that protects you from the outside effect of being attacked by these models. That's where he believes the bulk of the model, the value really is,
Right.
and that the model itself is sort of fungible because I'm going to pull it in there, and in the application layer, I'll do what I always do. I'm going to change the weights of the model, meaning I'm going to change how I train it, how I manage it, how it does what it does. I'm going to control what it can do and what it can't do, but I'm going to narrow it to be way more specific about not only your business, but the application I'm applying it to at that application layer. And so that layer is now built for you. It's licensed to you. I may have even partnered with you on this. And I've got a highly complex business. I've got high security requirements, likely, a lot of proprietary information. So that construction is just way out of whack in his mind because he's saying, look, as the application layer, I'm going to have to charge you for this. And that's where the value ought to be. And this was the argument that was the CNBC, started by the CNBC interview, but really articulated in his sovereignty argument that he was making, which he's made in his book, and then he's published it at the end of last year on the Palantir website. Where and we'll talk more about that in our papers that we're writing, but that becomes you now have done the most you can. You're managing it at the right level. You're managing the risks in a good way, but you're paying for it. And unfortunately, in his mind, you're paying for it too much because you're having to pay him to do it, and you're paying way too much for the model because you're putting too much of the price against not where the real value is and where the value is coming to you. And so those are the three scenarios you've got. One is where you're using a model by itself to help your business. And you kind of have to live by the rules of the marketplace, which is really tough. And he believes, and I think he's right, and he's got a lot of supporters, Nadella and others, including Salesforce, that say, you're right. You're right, it is. And a lot of company CEOs that are saying, yeah, you're right. We're putting the price in the wrong place of where the value is, but it's really hard to figure the value thing out. And it's not obvious. Then you've got as you were saying, the jagged frontier point where I'm using the model in different ways in the company, and I've now got to have to find some portfolio way to deal with this because I can't use unilateral approaches because that does all the wrong optimizations, right? So without getting into the details. And then you've got the answer, the big answer, but not every company is going to need what this application layer, for example, that a Palantir-like organization provides with their equivalent called an ontology layer. So those are really the conditions. Each one of them has a different requirement for the board and the practices the board brings to now how do I govern these environments? So, Deirdre, there are certain things that the board needs to now think differently about. When you think about this, how do you think about that?
As a board member,
Yeah, if you're now the person on the board and you're now trying to lead the board into as the probably not only a lead director, you may actually be the board chair. How do you lead them through thinking about this thing?
well, first of all, you have to know that you have to think about these things. I
Mhm.
was thinking and listening to you talk about value. I was wondering how many board members would even think, and this gets back to your point about inquiry and work fluency. How many board members would even stop to think and say, what's my value equation here? Where is the value resting here? Because board members are used to things being in specific places. So unless they understand the pricing and the vendor relationships here and so forth, they may not even know to ask the questions. So that I, as an individual board member, certainly as a board chair, for heaven's sakes, need to know enough to be able to know that a question needs to be asked. And I know that that's one of the things that people say that you know enough about any area of knowledge if you know how to ask the questions. Well, that's what it is here. This is a whole new area, and you have to know how to ask the questions. But let's talk about what else you need to know. We've outlined three scenarios, which may not sound to a casual listener all that different, but they involve vastly different ways of working with vendors, of working within companies, of requirements of boards. So you have to know what you're doing as a company here. Which of the scenarios are you using, or are you using something different? And what does that mean in terms of governance and risk management and finance, God knows, and representing stockholders and having the human resources right there, making sure that people are trained properly, making sure that people understand things like data privacy and data requirements and limitations on use of data. And is this framework that we've been using as a board, this ties back to what I was saying earlier, is this framework adequate for what we're facing here? And my answer to that, by and large, is no. It isn't. No board framework out there is sufficient for looking at what's happening now. Now, this doesn't mean that today every board needs to go out and create a new framework, because in another 2 years, that framework will have to change again. So you start to lose the consistency in all of your work here. Basically, what I think is boards need to develop a fluid way of thinking about governance. This ties back to the whole concept of work fluency that we've been talking about in multiple podcasts now in multiple ways, that it may no longer be possible, given all of the emerging technologies that are coming out, emerging, and that companies may want to be using. Boards need to perhaps have as steady as constants in their governance the facts that they need to be looking at these technologies in certain ways, but also have the fluidity to look at the technologies, all of the implications for the business, non-technological as well as technological, and say that, yes, this is how we have to think about all of these other things like talent. Let's use talent. Like if in a way, the talent in corporations is being ruled by the talent ethics in the technology industry itself, which may not be valid enough for corporations. So how do boards even think about this? So they know the things that they have to be looking about, but then have the fluency to adapt their governance to the way that these things are making corporations change. So it's not that you relax governance. In fact, you probably are even tighter about governance, but that your governance has to be realistic for the scenario that's unfolding in front of you. And your board directors and the board chair need to understand how to be fluent in this, where to be fluent, what they need to know to exercise the fluency. This is your whole work fluency question, Tom. And then they have to fit the role of a board fluent director in order to exercise their responsibilities appropriately. They need to understand this whole jagged frontier. Where do they have to have the absolute eagle eye at the moment? Technology, marketing, sales, maybe not so much on finance right now, but not that far behind. Maybe not that far, maybe not an absolute look at, say, inventory management, although not that far behind, or warehousing, but not that far behind. There's a little leeway, but not that much. So, and then the other thing that I think that board members really have to understand that they need to be fluent about is the whole concept of contract terms. How do you work with the different vendors in different vendor relationships to make sure that you are getting what you need from that vendor relationship? And it may not be the vendor relationship that some of these tech companies want, but you have to understand that you have options here. And you have to know how your technology can relate to the various options that you have, in terms of ownership of the weights, in terms of storage and caching and data usage and the learning loops and the prompting, all of those things we've been talking about. Because it may be, Tom, and I'm about to introduce another term, even though we're probably at the end of this video. I always do this. I tend to do this, introduce new terms at the end, knowing that we're going to be doing another video soon where we pick this up. The whole concept of the open models. The open models that maybe some companies are looking at because they provide better contract terms for the individual corporation. Do you want to touch on this, or maybe it's time we
I'll be happy to. No, I'll be happy to. Just so people are clear, there's a lot of, we say open models. The precise way to think about it is open weight models, meaning, and this is not open source. Open source models or open source software means you get the whole thing. You're just buying access to the whole thing. And open weights, what it essentially means is you you get to see and control how the model functions. That's the difference. And that is what is in debate. That there are a great number of tech execs, especially the Silicon Valley like investor groups, are saying we want open weight models. That's how we want to function here. Because everything we're talking about here, if you can control the weights, and you are then way ahead of this, because then you can control how the models function. many of the tech companies, the vendors, the biggest vendors that are dealing here, they don't want to do that. They don't want to make it open weight because they want to preserve their control. And when I say control, it's not just control, but it's also control of the value exchange, right? They want that vast amount of money to come to them. The more open weight they are, the more that they're just a utility, and they fit exactly what Alex Karp is talking about. Yeah, I'll just take it because I'm going to change those things anyway. And and what he's doing is just putting a layer in that changes it, and tries to keep the performance at the highest level instead of just going in there and changing it. So these are really tough questions, Deirdre. And you know, one thing though is when you're dealing with these issues, there are some similar questions you can ask, and you started to articulate what those are. For example, what is the current practice in your business for deploying these different models? Who's doing it? Who's making what decisions? Are they the right people? Do they have the right judgment going on there? And then are you comfortable that this delegated governance framework that you have out there in the organization are you okay with that as a board director, that it's being governed inside the organization? Okay. Then there is the question of, now you're looking at the hotspots. Who's going to need to transition to a different way to use these models? Who's next, right? And do you have the plan laid out well? And then looking at it from a different point of view, where is the concentration of the proprietary knowledge of the business? Where's the alpha? Who owns that alpha? Who's got their hands most involved in the alpha? And then next, there's a term, and I'll introduce this term now, that is a term that it's called intelligence exhaust, right? And this is meaning, and it is exactly what you think about. It's these proprietary knowledge people and how they're using the model, and how much of that really proprietary knowledge, whether it be the alpha knowledge or the how-to knowledge, is flowing, is exhausting where you don't want it to exhaust. And then the last one is the contract terms. Am I working with contractual terms that fit what I need, or are they legacy? Are they more cloud era like, or do they have specific traps in them that make problems for me? And you don't want them to be able to change things in a material way unilaterally, which some vendors did, and they got kicked out of environments in a big way because they unilaterally came in and said, no, we're changing who gets to decide what here. So you need to not need to, but it's helpful to look at all of those kinds of things as a board director when you're looking at the governance of this type of situation, and then the ones you articulated specifically. So this is a complex thing, and if you try to come to how do you end up here, Deirdre, at the end? We could get into the whole issue of what happened at OpenAI with their model escape. We could also get into, as you were describing earlier, the example of the ones that Anthropic said, look, we do a regular review of all of our models, especially in their testing environments, and in the process, we found the following, and here's what the real offenders did, where, as you said, there were 3 incidents that had a factor of 2 models per incident. So there were 6 runs total. And in one case, one of the models just did something they weren't supposed to do and rationalized that it was okay. Right? And by the way, that's a model that a lot of us use. Then the highest function model, it said it isn't okay, but it didn't stop. So it knew it was not right, but it didn't stop. It went ahead and did it anyway. And then there was a third model that is not a production model, a production released model. It actually recognized it and said, you know what, I shouldn't be continuing to function. It shut itself down, which is the right forensic way to deal with those problems. That's what you want the model to do. That is not what happened at OpenAI.
Right.
OpenAI's situation was very different. If you want to understand OpenAI, we've done a podcast on that, and we'll be ready. We'll be doing more as we get more information, and we'll do this comparison contrast to this model situation. So the good news about OpenAI, about Anthropic here, was they actually identified the details and told us, look, this is the right thing to do, and this is how it did it. And we had one that reacted properly. We had these that did not, and here's what they did. The problem is it broke into production level activity, which is exactly what the OpenAI did. So this is what you don't want. And what that means is likely not theirs. And this is what you're trying to worry about. And this is where people say, oh, the models, the mythos-like models can attack your cybersecurity aspects of this, right? Come right at you. And it sat in the case of OpenAI, it sat in the Huggy Face environment for a long time before even they knew it. And they knew it even before and the folks at OpenAI did. And there's some reasons why, and we went into it in the podcast. But at least here, they were tracking and they knew what they did, and they were able to understand it. So, Deirdre, we're about at the end. I will tell you there was a funny incident. Somebody I met years and years ago that was invested in the first company I helped build was Bill Gurley, and I learned an incredible amount from Bill. I'm still learning from Bill, including today, where he said, what the only thing I don't like, I'm paraphrasing, the only thing I don't like here is too often when we talk about these models doing things, we talk about them being entities unto themselves, and they're not.
Right.
That machines do what humans instruct them to do. We
Right.
built them, and they're just doing what we instructed them to do. And so instead of saying the model exhibited this behavior, no. Our model, not just the model, our model did. And so there's a very funny set of things. We'll go through this when we go through the compare and contrast when we understand the OpenAI break in more detail. Interestingly enough, we have enough to do the Anthropic because they announced it,
Right.
to their credit,
Right.
where we still are waiting for the details of the OpenAI. We have a lot. We did a podcast on it, but we reserve the right to get too deep here because we don't actually know as much as we know about the Anthropic. But the point is here, Anthropic did do it in the right way, but the quibble that Bill Gurley had was, look, you did it. You did it so well. You did exactly what we'd want you to do if this happened, right? We'd prefer it not to happen, but if it happened, we prefer it be handled this way, except you didn't take full responsibility. You applied the responsibility to the model. You said, well, the model did this. No. Our model did that. So everybody knows you are responsible for it having done that. It doesn't do it on its own. And this is a problem, Deirdre, that you and I have been upset about this way of characterizing. And we see it too often where, well, the model is out of control. Well, the reason it's out of control is because you let it get out of control. You gave it all the conditions to allow it to. And I'll end on this. Deirdre, this is the point that we constantly are making. It's your job to move how you are leading that machine because the machine's moving at speeds that like most people have never seen before. And you have to be moving faster as a human because it's your job to lead it. Your team somewhere, either you bought it, you are renting it, or you created it. And you are the one that has to watch and push that edge case. You have to push the edge case and say, not only how do I design this environment, but then to stop and say to yourself, all right, with those parameters, what could this thing do?
Mhm.
Using my best knowledge and judgment as a forward-looking person here. What could it do? And have I done everything responsibly to deal with what it could do? And Anthropic, to their credit, basically said, no, we didn't. We should have been able to do this better. So I'm going to let you take. We've got more. We even have a checklist that we would give a board director to say, if you were going to checklist this, there are 6 items that we would recommend you keep in mind. But we'll deal with that in some other capacity. But there is so much here. We're now, Deirdre, you took this thing for an hour and 15 minutes. What I mean.
Tom, there's just so much here. I have no doubt that our next video is going to pick up on more episodes. Do not
Yes.
think that because today is the last day of July, that these episodes will start. I can guarantee you that more episodes will come out. But what all of these point to is the need for imagination in the mind of board directors. You can't simply look at what's in front of you. You have to know enough to be able to think through not only what's happening, but what could happen. This is the good risk management. This is the good security practice and so forth. And I think that what we've been trying to do in this video is to point out how very necessary this is in board directors, and also maybe point to how a lot of board directors have some studying to do here. But why don't we end at this point, Tom, knowing that our next video will be picking up some of these points again.
Yes, it was humorous that poor Deirdre didn't know we were going to talk about a lot of this today because we had some of these things happen this morning. And so I'm there, I'm prepping just like Deirdre is, and I see Bill Gurley's thing come in, and I see the Anthropic thing. So I redid the preparation here. So poor Deirdre is saying, wait a minute, you changed the game on me. So we're actually recording this a few hours later. But there's so much, I mean, in your intuitive knowledge of it covers all the issues anyway. It's just we're just having new data points. As you said, new data points are arising quickly now.
Well, you're giving me the opportunity to say that I'm demonstrating work fluency and the ability to ask the right
Yes, Deirdre, I know.
question.
That is absolutely true. And no, we appreciate it. And thank you for bearing with me of throwing new information at everybody here today. But it just proves that this is exactly what Deirdre was saying. This is exactly what we think you're going to be dealing with as a board member going forward, is you're going to get the CEO walking in with me functioning like the CEO and Deirdre's the board director trying to make sense of what I've just thrown on the table here. And this is, but the point is the same. And Deirdre, you said this. It's about having that forward-looking, that pushing the knowledge and the edge case forward about how do I judge these situations? How do I ask the right questions? I may not know the answers, but at least I have a sense of where this is going and what do I need to think about.
Right.
And we're going to be continuing to develop this so that we give you that, hopefully that, so you don't have to say, well, this is beyond what I do. No, it's not beyond anybody that we know that's probably listening to this or watching us. So with that, Deirdre, it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Tom. So long for now.